a panel that looks at the remuant. Remuant. Probably remuant in English means something else than in modern day French remuant. But we will learn about that. I introduced the two speakers first, and I personally think we should have the talks and then we have communal question, if that's okay with both Emil and Chris. Yeah. So I will do all my work now and then come back for the discussions afterward. Professor Chris Mounsey, who is standing here from the University of Winchester, has had what from the outside looks like a traditional academic career and has risen to the dizzy heights of a full professor in 18th century English literature, and then went blind and started to write about being enabled, disabled, variable. From the inside it looks quite different, as he told us. From the first day Chris came out to his colleagues and was told by his Marxist boss that homosexuality was an affectation of the upper classes, which would resolve into heterosexuality after the revolution. So from this day to the day he was denounced from the pulpit of his local church for writing a book called Being the Body of Christ Towards the 21st Century Homosexual Theology of the Anglican Church. Came out in 2012. In which he dared to suggest that homosexuality was not a trick God had played on him. Now, apart from numerous books, Chris edited important volumes that you might know, including the 2007 volume Queer People and the 2014 or even 15 volume Enabling the Idea of Disability in the 18th Century.
That's 2014.
2014, thank you. He also, if you still need a good book to recommend to your undergraduate students, he authored for Oxford the Study Skills Guide, How to Write Great Essays and Dissertations. Currently, he's finishing a book on blindness in the 18th century, or more or less finished,
It
right?
is finished.
It is finished. He's the editor of the Journal of 18th Century Studies, and he's been running the Queer People Conference series since 2002, and now the Variabilities Conferences and the Queer Bodies Symposia that intersect with them, or that interchange with them. So this is Professor Chris Mounsey.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Thank you all very much for your welcome to Canterbury. One thing that he didn't say in his introduction is that Emil was formerly my PhD student, and as often happens with PhD students, they start teaching you things you didn't know. And I came up with an idea of variability, which Bea mentioned before, because it doesn't use binary oppositions. And the remuant, I think, is the philosophy behind it. So we're going to start with, I'm going to talk about variability and the variable body, and how to access the variable body, how to do history of the body, which is the easy part. And then Emil will come in with the difficult bit, explaining the philosophy behind what it is that we're trying to do. And I say that we are trying to do. We don't work together in a sense of working together, but we have dinner at least once a week, get drunk together and talk about what we're doing. So we are working together, but we don't publish together. The other thing as well you might have noticed is that it's darker in here. That's because you have to be blind people, so you have to see how I do. I can't see any of your faces. I can't recognize any of you. So if you want to talk to me, please do talk to me. But you have to come up to me and tell me who you are. I recognise people by shapes and by voices, so that's just how it is. It also means I can't read all of my paper. This is Stan, who is my access to work assistant, who is my eyes and also my PhD student. Always a very good thing to have somebody who understands you on all levels. And so Stan and I will do a sort of a double act here, where I will read just about as much as I can, and then Stan will fill the other bits in. So my paper today is The Limits of Knowing the Variable Body. At a recent conference at Reading University, I was surprised to hear a paper on disability studies in the early modern period, which mentioned the contemporary shock horror gasp about the question of whether disabled people were truly deserving, or whether they were faking blindness or loss of limbs, or had even maimed themselves so as to be entitled to handouts from either the monasteries, when there were any, or from the poor laws, when there weren't.
The focus reminded me of when I began to work on homosexuality about 20 years ago, when apparently all the records of homosexuals in the 18th century were confined to the court records. I remember asking the question of a panel at the Group for Early Modern Cultural Studies, what about the homosexual people who got away with it? Who were never tried in courts of law, and who lived quietly, perhaps with a lifelong partner, like Anne Lister, whose coded diaries I then discovered were being translated by Helen Whitbread. As if by magic, hundreds of other homosexual people crawled out of the woodwork, and it was quickly disclosed that one had merely to decode what homosexuals in history were writing to find them in their texts telling the stories of their lives and loves.
Soon afterwards, Caroline Gondra and I set up the Queer People Conferences at Christ's College, Cambridge, in 2002, to search for our homosexual foremothers and forefathers, for the experiences of people who shared our same-sex sexualities, but who lived in the 18th century or earlier. We were working in parallel with the dominant Foucauldian theoretical model of the day, using historicist methodology to describe case studies of sexualities. Careful not to read ourselves into our subjects, the papers at the conferences explored examples of sexualities within their own particular context. Our methodology was derived from the belief that rather than reducible to a discourse or a set of discourses, sexuality is better explained as the body acting upon its mind's desires. Sexuality, we claimed, was the link, or at least one link, between the mind and its body. It was different for every person. It could not be predicted or gauged against a norm, even though, and although a politics could outlaw it, it would never go away.
Even though the subject in a sexual relationship may be classified by their political and social condition, that set of values does not mask the basic desires or the response of the body to those desires. If a king commands his footman to sodomise him, the footman might be personally inclined to do so, or he might not, but he will try to do what the king commands because of the subordinate role. However, the king cannot command the footman to desire him or to maintain an erection out of desire for him. At the heart of this example is the irrefutable logic of the body and its mind's desires. The king may crave the footman's physical attention, but all his political power cannot answer the blank stare of unreciprocated desire. Even if the footman is able to use his own fantasy to bring himself to the point where he can fulfil the king's wishes, the act so consummated is not the same as a consensual and mutually desired act.
In the histories of sexuality, I argued that the part of the body which escapes the political is its own most uniqueness, its inalienable desire for fulfillment. When I began to have problems with my sight, I realised that disability was perhaps another link between the mind and its body, although it works in a different way.
In the idea of disability in the 18th century, I argued that my experience of my homosexuality is radically different from my experience of my vision impairment. I have always known I was homosexual and never practised any other form of sexuality. nor have I deliberately tried to pass as a heterosexual. When I discuss my sexuality with friends, I explain that it was never possible for me to have tried heterosexuality, since encounters with women never led to sexual arousal, while those with men did. My sexuality was never fluid or changeable. Sexuality, I could never be other than I have always been. Sexually, I could never be other than I have always been. My sight problem is equally deep-seated, as I have until recently been able to get by adequately using the vision I was born with. However, although I always felt there was something wrong with my sight from an early age, because I had no experience of anybody else's sight against which to gauge the deficiencies in my own, I did not know how impaired my sight was until I was 50, when a new set of circumstances led to my first diagnosis. In consequence, I have lived, or at least passed, as a sighted person for most of my life.
This is not to say that all experiences of sexuality and disability are the same as mine. On the contrary, I would argue that all experiences of sexuality and disability are as variable as one another, from one another, as my experiences of my sexuality and my disability. And they should be treated as different. And this is my point. My experiences of my sexuality and my disability are not commensurate with each other, and nor are they commensurate with those of other people. So I would question whether the intersections that are noticeable in the Foucauldian analysis of sexuality and disability may be products of the analytical tool rather than the history. My conclusion becomes clearer as vision impairment and homosexuality are remarkably the same for me politically, since British laws protect me from discrimination both as a homosexual man and as a disabled man. My experience of each in my daily life may be very different, but nevertheless I am willy-nilly the subject of anti-discrimination legislation to gain me equality of access. But is my experience reducible to or accountable only within the political fight for access?
As early as 1999, Elizabeth Bredberg noticed in disability history that accounts of the lived experience of disabled people remain very much underrepresented. Disability history, in ironic consequence, seems to sustain the depersonalised and institutionalised representation of disabled people that its authors undoubtedly deplore. At the same time, her paper notes that there are several collections of biographies of deaf people, and she concludes with the suggestion that any real development in disability history will come from the work of investigators who have developed interpretive competence with primary experiential accounts as well. However, Bredberg leaves unanswered the question as to what interpretive competence might be. And I believe this is the nub of the matter. How do we go about interpreting people without falling into the trap of applying a one-size-fits-all theory to explain both their sexualities and disabilities, which both sexuality studies and disability studies has hitherto been prone in their turn to the Foucauldian analysis?
When we look for more detail about the whole lives of historical people, the expectation of a fundamental variability might be of some help. Variability is by no means transhistorical, as it would expect blind people in the 18th century to be different from blind people in the 21st century in the way they were treated or understood, in the same way that we would expect that every person in each century had different experiences of and with their peculiar abilities. But variability nevertheless would nevertheless expect someone who was blind in the 18th century to have similar difficulties in, say, accessing text as blind people in the 21st century, although they would understand themselves in a different way and would expect different solutions. Above all, variability would not suggest that difference was binary. Deaf people in the 18th century were as different from blind people as they were different from those who thought themselves normal. Variability would suggest that there never was a reference point of normal that defined those who were not. Variability would expect that every normal person was as different, variable, as every other normal person.
Variability is a concept that enshrines uniqueness. has the patience to discover the peculiarities of each individual, and by so doing captures particular people rather than an institutionalised representation of disabled people. As such, it is a useless concept for those who are seeking power relations between groups who define themselves as the same against another. But it is a good way to notice people in history, and perhaps more importantly, to notice whole people.
One of the least holistic aspects of the academy is the subject area. Am I looking for my subject's sexuality or their disability? We organise our courses around this type of separation as well as our conferences. We can learn to talk between periods if we have a narrow enough vein of interest. I learned that in the Queer People conferences when Sue Lancer invited Valerie Traub to the first one, and Caroline and I both squeaked, "But she's a Renaissance specialist, and we work in the 18th century." So again, as we have just done in the Variabilities conference, invited Irina Metzler, a medievalist, and understood her because she was talking about disability. But can we also, and would we want to, connect the dots between studies and periods if we go looking for the body in all, well, at least more than one, of its variable manifestations? This is what I want to do in the rest of my talk. And as you'll soon find out, I think that we can and should, since it's remarkable how widening one's focus gets you out of making some terrible errors. So here's a history of some of my and other people's errors.
So we're going to start with Thomas Gills, the blind man of St Edmundsbury. I've written 2 papers about Thomas Gills, one published in the Idea of Disability in the 18th Century, which is wrong, and a new one in my forthcoming The Birth of the Clinic, which is not, I hope. What went wrong with the first paper was my rush to find blind writers to write about. Well, I am a professor of English, and I was transfixed by the epithet Gills gave himself in the title of 4 of the 6 publications available on Echo, The Blind Man of St Edmundsbury. Starting off from his first publication in 1707, Instructions for Children, in verse, I read on the first page, "My condition is as low, poor, blind and lame, and being so, I can no better way descry than this to get a penny by. Then pray, dislike not what I do, to help myself and others too. And if you buy this book of me, you do 2 acts of charity. To children good advice you give, and grant me wherewithal to live." And I took him at his word. He was poor, blind and lame, a disabled pauper. And following that single path towards disability studies, I constructed a mythical story about him, supplementing poor law handouts with publications that were all from London, a city, I argued, in which it was more likely that he would have been paid for his work by a publisher than in Bury, which has only one printer, who also worked in Stamford in Lincolnshire. When I discovered a cache of 8 more pamphlets by Gills in the National Library of Scotland, 6 of which were unknown to me, I discovered 2 things. First, that his pamphlets were printed by Richard Janeway, who was neither a bookseller nor a publisher, and second, that even a blind man can have a sexuality. In the 18th century, a printer like Janeway would make his money charging people directly for his work. He usually worked for booksellers who were in effect publishers, as they would stand the charge of printing, and the author would make any money that was left over. But since only Janeway is mentioned on Gills' pamphlets, it must have been Gills who paid for the printing. Thus, I had to conclude that Gills was not a poor blind man, but a blind businessman who can no better way descry than this to get his penny by. Further bombshells were to come in another of these new pamphlets called The Blind Man's Case at London, which is a Jonathan Swift type poem describing the scene in a London street. I want to quote at length because there is only one copy of this in the world, and it's the funniest poem I've ever come across. It's absolutely brilliant.
to see in miry streets below what different throngs pass to and fro, as lawyers, ministers and laymen, chair-bearers, hackneymen and draymen, black chimney-sweepers, brawny porters, powdered beaux, brave as courtiers, fine misses primmed with paint and patches, and tattered girls that sell card matches. Starved, ragged boys with dirty faces cry 2 a penny, long thread laces. Some folks decked richly to excess, and some in such a wretched dress as scarcely covers nakedness. Some women's necks with pearls and lockets, some yoked between 2 tubs like buckets. Some heads with lace and ribbons dressed, and some with heavy loads oppressed. Milkwives with flat-crowned caps and biggins, bear on their heads huge pails like piggins, milk, dirty hairs, straws together swigging. Some few complexions fresh and clear, and numerous dowdy ones are here, old withered wives with necks flea-bitten, and maids that look as if beshitten. Low, crooked forms with homely features, and many blind and crippled creatures, some with their arms quite shrunk and small, others have no arms at all. Some have but one, and some no legs, but move about on 2 wooden pegs. Such is the mingled medley throng that hourly pass the streets along. Here goes a furious scolding scab, and there a nasty drunken drab, who from the brandy shop now come with draggled tail goes reeling home, brimful of kindness and Genevie. She says to all she meets, Lord save ye.
However delightful the scene described, I hear you asking, how can Thomas Gills, the blind man of St Edmundsbury, see the scene? Well, he didn't. The line before this tells us who does the looking.
In ruinous room 3 stories high, up close dark staircase here, I lie with little Deb and Nab, my wife, who share in these fatigues of life. Sometimes to please herself, no doubt, at garret window Deb looks out, and from that elevated station casts down her eyes with admiration.
We have therefore a fascinating picture of an 18th century family business. Deb describes what she sees from their 3-story window. Tom translates what she saw into verse, and Nab writes it down. They then pay Richard Janeway to print it, and Tom would be taken to a convenient place where he would sell the booklets to make what money he could. The poem gives us further fascinating details about the reason why Gills was in a place he hated, which is because Janeway said he'd make half-crowns rather than half-pence from each copy, which turns out not to be true, and the poem itself was a plea to Tom's benefactor to help his return to his beloved Bury St Edmunds.
What my mistake taught me was not to read for just disability. Thomas Gills was not just a disabled man, he had a sexuality, and he married Frances Hawkins on the 5th of June 1675, and they had a family, as well as Deb. Another Thomas Gills is noted as a freeholder to have voted in the 1735 election in Norwich. This Thomas may or may not have been a son of the blind man of Bury. Our poet died in 1715, so it's not impossible for them to be related. The Gills and Hawkins families of East Anglia were clockmakers, and concentrating on such fine work may be the reason for Gills' blindness. With a family, our disabled man has changed completely from the lone blind man whom I wrote out of thin air at my first attempt. But have I gotten closer to him in my second?
So moving on to Nicholas Saunderson. I am not the only biographer of a blind man who has made such a mistake about a blind man's sexuality, thank goodness. But the mistake made about Nicholas Saunderson in the 1766 Biographica Britannica is one of a completely different order, and teaches us new lessons about the queerness of sexuality and its relationship to blindness. The lesson to learn here is that blind men fall in love in different ways from sighted men, and a moment's reflection would bring any professor of English, well that's what I am, to recall Lovelace from Bamberg's The Relapse, who falls in love with Berintha at the theatre and tells her that his love began with their eyes meeting.
When 'twas my chance to see you at a play, a random glance you threw at first alarmed me. I could not turn my eyes from whence the danger came. I gazed upon you till you shot again, and then my fears came on me. My heart began to pant, my limbs to tremble, my blood grew thin, my pulse beat quake, my eyes grew hot and dim, and all the frame of nature shook with apprehension.
Loveless is a reformed rake who has relapsed and fallen in love, hook, line and sinker, at first sight. But falling in love that way is something a blind man like Nicholas Saunderson cannot do. I argued above that Thomas Gills was probably sighted when he met Francis Hawkins, but Nicholas Saunderson lost both eyes at 2 months old as a result of smallpox. With no knowledge of what things look like, let alone people, Saunderson lived in a spatial world of mathematics. He was a hugely popular teacher at Cambridge University, and the real world enlivened all Nicholas Saunderson's calculations in his textbook, The Elements of Algebra of 1740, with sorting out bar bills being the example he gave to his students to help them learn differential calculus. But Saunderson wrote little of beauty. He used the word seldom and only in connection with the truth of mathematics.
My chief design herein is to show the beauty and consistency of truth, the necessary connection one truth has with another, and how much more clearly and distinctly this harmony is to be perceived in the mathematical sciences than in any other whatsoever. And yet, after all, is it not impossible, but that I may, in a great measure, lose my labour? A single third-hand glimpse of a story about Saunderson falling in love gives us some suggestions of his more private experience in the world. In a note to the Biographia Britannica article about how he met his wife, we read, "It was said at the time by his friends that his love was kindled by feeling her eyelashes." Whenever I tell this story, people begin to wonder how this could have happened. Did he hear her voice and say, "You look nice. Sorry, you sound nice. Please can I feel your eyelashes?" In an age marked by propriety and sexual excess with prostitutes, which govern women's sexual behaviour, when, as Alexander Pope says, "a third interprets motions, looks and eyes, at every word a reputation dies,"
I cannot believe the encounter between Saunderson and his future wife happened quite that way. But one of my friends, who is a mother of 2 children, told me how intimate it was to tickle her children on the cheek with her eyelashes. Intimate it may be, but it is certainly a queer way to fall in love. I have argued elsewhere that the Biographia Britannica sketch was written by Zachary Gray under a cloud of political and religious differences. So perhaps it is not surprising that Gray interposes amid an article which is little more than a paean to Saunderson's brilliance as a teacher of mathematics, the sentence,
Like his predecessor Whiston, he uttered his sentiments of men not only freely but licentiously, with a kind of contempt and disregard for decency and common sense, and, which is worse, he indulged himself in women, wine and profane swearing to a shocking excess, by which means he did more hurt to the reputation of mathematics than he did good by his eminent skill in the science.
But there still seems to be some purchase in the recollection of the way he fell in love with his wife, that whether or not he was drunk and a womanizer holds some sort of truth. A note to the note about Saunderson and his wife's eyelashes impresses the idea of Saunderson's carnality, as he had to touch people in order to know them.
It is certain he acquired most of his ideas first by his sense of feeling, which he had in great acuteness and perfection, as it commonly happens to the blind, through the necessity of application.
An interest in Saunderson's sexuality is perhaps not surprising in an age where the most readily available sex manual, Aristotle's masterpiece completed, did little more than recommend a healthy diet for the begetting of children, and gave no indication of how women are impregnated. In offering a word of advice to both sexes, being several directions respecting the act of copulation, The manual coyly informs the couple, before they begin their conjugal embraces, to invigorate their mutual desires and make their flames burn with a fiercer ardour by those endearing ways that love can better teach than I can write. Added to which the philosophical text that spoke at length of the experiences of people blind from birth, and both Diderot and Hartley proclaimed the primacy of touch with direct reference to Saunderson, it becomes clear that blind people who could not become interested or excited by the beauty of a beloved person could learn those endearing ways that love can teach only from bodily contact. Saunderson apparently never learned to write, so there are no love letters to his wife, nor do we know what he thought of other places usually associated with beauty, such as being in a garden surrounded by flowers, other than the fact that he knew when a cloud passed over the sun. In his remaining books designed to teach his students mathematics, and Diderot's and Hartley's use of only his rigorous scientific persona to found a materialistic philosophy, we lose the emotional aspect of Nicholas Saunderson's self-presence. We are told he was stoic in the face of his own death.
He received the notice of his approaching death with great calmness and serenity, and after a short silence resuming life and spirit, he talked with as much composure as usual. He was supposed not to entertain any great notion of revealed religion, yet we are told he appointed to receive the sacrament the evening before his death, which a delirium that never went off prevented him from doing.
But was he happy in life? We are told he demonstrated much vivacity and wit in conversation, so that none could be a better companion. But what did he talk about with such animation? What made him happy? Was it the beauty of the truth of mathematics? Was it loose women and alcohol? Or was it the touch of his wife's eyelashes? What Zachary Gray was doing in his nasty account of Saunderson was giving a zealous high churchman's denunciation of a popular lecturer in mathematics who had spread the idea that revealed religion had no truths to tell. His mistake, however, teaches us something much more, that when we approach a blind man, we must put aside ourselves and our own experiences of sight when we construct the narrative of someone whose life is so different from our own. But although this might be so, it also leaves us with a series of questions.
How far should we be imaginative in constructing the narratives of the whole lives of our subject? How whole should a whole life be? How valuable is our work if we explore just the disability of our subject, or their sexuality, or their religion?
And so on to our third subject, John Maxwell. I want to finish with a brief look at John Maxwell of York being blind, because all these questions are at stake in my reading of my third blind man. I have searched all the York church records in York libraries and everywhere I can think of, and have found next to nothing about this writer of 7 pamphlets in the form of verses, plays and religious tracts between 1740 and 1761, each with a long subscription list of some 200 local worthies of York. The text I've chosen to explore is his prose piece, The Polite Assembly of 1757, which we can see from its title page bears the subtitle, The Charms of Solitude Displayed. I made the choice because the subtitle suggests that we shall find out something of Maxwell when alone to himself, which lends itself to the biographical. The very words, the charms of solitude displayed, are of course to some extent not true. Maxwell is not displaying himself to himself, as he cannot see the words that were written down for him by his amanuensis, but he is displaying himself to us the readers, well, those of us who can see, in what becomes a conspicuous act of autobiography. In a sense, Maxwell says, I am displaying myself to you in my solitude. But even this turns out not to be solitude, since a friend is with him. A friend who is necessarily with him to write down the words.
I want to read very closely Thus, waking from this lethargy of life amid such solemn silence and retirement, both which invite me now to sweet reflection, having given laud to him who gave us being, and crave protection for his present day, I will indulge myself in contemplation. This is actually in verse. It's 5-beat Miltonic blank verse, to be precise. Thus, waking from this lethargy of life, amidst such solemn silence and retirement, both which invite me now to sweet reflection, having given laud to him who gave us being, and crave protection for this present day, I will indulge myself in contemplation.
It is also therefore a litany, as the OED tells us, an appointed form of public prayer, usually of a penitential character, consisting of a series of supplications, deprecations and intercessions, in which the clergy lead and the people respond. The same formula of response being repeated for several successive clauses. There is no priest to give the call for Maxwell's response, as this is a recollection of a private prayer, but the fact is it is in verse suggests a repetition every morning.
Conclusion: Maxwell is religious. Question: is he Orthodox Anglican, or Catholic, or dissenting? I don't know. So let's continue. This humble lodging's neatness is enough to satisfy the need of simple nature in its repose, whose little lattice is so artfully contrived, with curious chinks which gratefully convey such pleasing fragrance in this warm season, distilling from variety of flowers which so luxuriant grow. They shade the day, and seem as if they did rejoice to pay most liberally the hand that did dispose them.
It seems indubitable that Maxwell has woken from sleeping on a summer's night. Like Nicholas Saunderson, Maxwell can tell if he is in the sunlight or shade, not because he can see the sun, but because of the heat. There is little furniture in the room, but then this is best for blind people, so there is nothing to trip up over.
Conclusion: Maxwell has been sleeping in or near a garden, which he recognises from smell rather than colours. Questions: is this a garden room with a wooden lattice window, which suggests Maxwell is wealthy or has wealthy friends? Or is this a diamond-paned leaded light window in which the glass has been broken, which suggests Maxwell is poor?
I don't know, so let's continue.
Here is an object near, my sleeping friend, whom much I love for his good sense, yet more for his good will, in making that good sense always conducive to benefit mankind. I grasp his hand.
We are introduced to the amanuensis as though we too are blind. He is an object first, which on feeling becomes a friend. The change is like the change we all undergo on waking, moving from sleeplessness to consciousness of our surroundings. But we are learning how a blind man wakes up, not seeing things around him.
Conclusion: the two have been sleeping in the same room. Question: are they in a double bed? Maxwell reaches out to grasp his hand.
The room has been described as having little furniture, fit for a blind man, and Maxwell does not describe fumbling about to find the friend. Let's go on.
I grasp his hand. Alas, he knows it not, no more than if I now did take my leave of him, if wrapped within his winding sheet or in his coffin, he lies bereft of everything that is rational.
Is that me?
Yes, right, I'll read it. The depth of emotion at finding his friend inanimate and believing him dead gives us an account of just how little a blind man knows about his surroundings. Conclusion: blind people need sighted people to help them. Question: is Maxwell in love with his friend? Does the fact they are sharing a bed suggest that it is not just platonic, the platonic love of a blind man for his helper? Does the fact that their relationship is couched in religious terms suggest that Maxwell is trying to sublimate his feelings for his friend? Or is this the public face of a private and intimate relationship, suitable to sell to make him money? Answers on a postcard, please.
And as you can see, not all sighted people can see.